The latest escalation between Israel and the Palestinians needs to be put in perspective and not taken out of context. Since the establishment of Israel, the Israelis have killed over 100,000 indigenous Palestinians, whereas just over 6,000 Israelis who are settlers were killed as a response. If our sympathy is genuine, then surely most of it would go with the indigenous Palestinians, the ones under foreign occupation. Yet, for some reason, we're being told that the Palestinians are the ones to blame. The latest war has seen unprecedented amount of media coverage. It has also seen an unprecedented amount of disinformation, bias, manipulation and lies on mainstream media platforms, alongside the typical terrorist labeling of the Palestinian side. The interesting thing is, particularly with the British government with this example, is the fact that the side that they're unwaveringly supporting in this conflict, which is Israel, and in particular the Israeli army, was formed of groups that the British government itself considered to be terrorist organizations, and I will elaborate on that shortly. But to begin with, many countries consider Israel to be an ally, and this reflects on their coverage of the events, magnifying Israel's losses and casualties even when it's based on lies. Headlines such as 40 babies were beheaded that were published all over the world led many reporters, news networks, and even the American president himself having to retract from it. However, only when the damage has been done and the public was exposed to these lies deliberately. They ignore reports from Israeli hostages who confess that they were treated well and humanely, like the ones I shared on my community tab. They look at Israel through a magnifying lens and on the Palestinians through a microscope, undermining the ongoing tragedy, displacement, daily harassment, killing, and injustice against the indigenous Palestinians, all to legitimize Israel as a neo-settler colonial entity, stealing native lands and treating its inhabitants as subhumans by words and actions, as we've seen throughout history. Disregarding international law, violating it consistently, and relying on the American veto to save it. It's healthy to have different points of view on the conflict and have people covering it from both sides. However, there's a big problem when the government starts to intimidate one side at the expense of another. There are many examples around the Western world and in the UK. For example, the UK Home Secretary Suella Braverman sent a message to all chief constables and police and crime commissioners on the 10th of October that states, "Sadly, experience indicates that whenever Israel is attacked, Islamists and other racists seek to use legitimate Israeli defensive measures as a pretext to stir up hatred against British Jews and increase fear within the Jewish community." There are multiple problems with that statement. The first one is the Islamophobic tone that she is using while simultaneously claiming to be protecting the Jewish people from anti-Semitism. The word Islamist, which is malicious in intent, is followed by the word racist, suggesting that Islam as a religion is linked to racism. She gets away with this easily and is not accused of Islamophobia. The second one is the legitimate Israeli defensive measures, which quite frankly speaks for itself, for its bizarreness and detachment from reality, as Israel has always been attacking Palestinians and overseas nations. She followed up by adding, behaviors that are legitimate in some circumstances, for example, the waving of a Palestinian flag, may not be legitimate as such when intended to glorify acts of terrorism. Again, the Home Secretary is linking the Palestinian flag to terrorism, that magic stick they use whenever they want to justify crimes, delegitimize criticism, and instill fear in the public. It starts with Hamas as a front, only to reach Palestine as a whole, which is their ultimate goal. By doing that, the Home Secretary is doing exactly the opposite of what she is ordering the police force in the UK to do, stirring up hatred against communities in Britain. That is unless the Home Secretary does not mind stirring up racism against the Muslim and Arab communities in the UK. After all, she has a history of racist and Islamophobic statements, and it's not surprising that all the extreme right wing in the UK is supporting Israel and embracing the government's narrative. The Director General of the MI5, Ken McCallum, warned about this in 2021. In an interview he had with the BBC security correspondent, giving an overview of threats facing the UK, Mr. McCallum mentioned the main form of extremism: right-wing terrorism. He even said that it was sadly here to stay, with 10 out of 29 attack plots disrupted in the last 4 years leading to 2021 linked to it. He added, "Racism is a toxic issue that MI5 confronts every day, most visibly in our work to deal with extreme right-wing terrorism. Racism is not the only sole fuel of that threat, but it is strongly there." To deal with it, he noted that if we were to find ourselves overly looking to blame abroad for this phenomenon of racism, we might risk not owning a portion of the problem that is ours within our own country. It wasn't only McCallum who warned about this, but also Britain's former counter-terrorism officer, Neil Basu. 2 years ago, the British government conducted a review of the highly controversial PREVENT policy, which is intended to prevent extremism and terrorism. It has been highly criticized to be targeting the Muslim community more than any other community, particularly for the repeated use of the word Islamism in it, which has both racist and Islamophobic connotations. For the review, the British government appointed William Shawcross, a journalist who had no professional depth to conduct such a review. Shawcross called Muslims in Europe a vast fifth column who wish to destroy us. He also said that we should not shy away from labeling the problem Islamic fascism. Does this sound familiar to another supposed problem Europe had in the early 20th century? We all know what that led to. This was the guy Suella Braverman appointed to review an already racist document. In his response to the review, former counter-terrorism chief Neil Basu stated that it was insulting. He also said that the review was driven by a right-wing viewpoint that extreme right-wing terrorism is either unimportant or doesn't really exist. Many security experts shared their concern, in addition to the top 2 security officials from the MI5 and counter-terrorism departments. So why is the government in denial? According to PREVENT's own statistics, from April 2021 to March 2022, for the second year in a row, referrals because of extreme right-wing radicalization were 20% higher than any other referrals. And this is an ongoing trend. So, an important question arises here. Is the Home Secretary ignoring top security officials who actually know what's happening based on verified evidence? And if so, then why? To answer this question, we need to state some facts. The political class commonly acts against its country's national interest. Look at Brexit in the UK, for example. In the US, the Bush administration dragged its allies to war with Afghanistan after 9/11, the biggest false flag operation in recent history, and one that the US government never investigated, only to leave 20 years later and get the Taliban back in power immediately. They also invaded Iraq based on a big lie that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. The British Shilcoat report reached this conclusion against Tony Blair and his government, yet no action was taken against the perpetrators. The American and British governments burned tons of taxpayers' money and sent their troops to either get killed or get back injured, traumatized, and suffering from PTSD based on lies. The US and its allies spent trillions in total in these unnecessary wars, killing millions and wreaking havoc in the Middle East, only to profit greedy corporations that thrive on human loss and suffering. Now, please note, they went to these wars under the ever-reaching pretext of the war on terror, without clear definitions of the objectives, no time limits, no geographical limits, nothing. Terrorism. Terrorism is not a country. It's a term open to multiple definitions that governments use to reach their objectives and instill fear in the public from questioning their actions. It's also an open check for the military-industrial complex and big corporations at the expense of innocent people who have been unjustifiably labeled as terrorists to dehumanize them in the minds of the perpetrators' public. The phrases corrupt politicians and career politicians didn't come out of nowhere. Most of them are hardly interested in anyone else but themselves, their parties, and their donors. Which leads us back to the answer. Of course, the Home Secretary is ignoring top security officials, at least the ones with an independent voice. She's also deliberately promoting Islamophobia and racism to appeal to the extreme right wing in the UK for the elections. The irony is, she is promoting bigotry and hatred towards the Muslim community and simultaneously showing supposed care for the Jewish community, linking them to Israel, something that's both not true and dangerous. In fact, some secular and Orthodox Jews call it anti-Semitic. Linking religious communities to countries and political entities is risky business. It sends a message that all members of this community somehow condone or support a certain country, in this case Israel, even though both the Jewish and Israeli communities are more divided than ever when it comes to Israel, how it should look, or if it should even exist. Many Jewish people are anti-Zionists, whether Orthodox religious Jews or secular Jews. The Orthodox Jewish Neturei Karta pray on a daily basis for Israel to disappear and take action towards this. The government's support to Israel is not based on love for the Jewish people, it's based on interests. Israel serves corporate and geopolitical interests in the Middle East. Not long ago, Joe Biden told Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog, "I've often said, Mr. President, if there were not an Israel, we'd have to invent one." Now you can invent a country with different people, races and religions, as long as they serve your imperial interests. The harsh truth is that religion is being used as a tool to achieve political and financial gain when many people are not even aware of it. Another thing we're seeing since this war began is the increased censorship, media lies, and bias. The mainstream media rhetoric is prevailing and opposing views are not being heard. There are attempts to censor the Palestinian narrative at any cost on many levels. Not just in the UK, but in every country aligned with Israel. Similar to the censorship on the Russian war in Ukraine. Russian media was banned and still is in many Western countries. Is it because they don't want the public to question the ever-expanding reach of NATO and its funding from the people's pockets? After all, they need your money and they will do whatever it takes to justify taking it from you, and one of the most common ways to do so is make you fearful. During the Israeli escalation in 2021, a pro-Palestinian protester in London was struck by a hit-and-run driver. This event hardly had any mention on mainstream media, and no one called this a terrorist or a mob attack. Pro-Palestine protests in Britain are peaceful, yet they are maliciously being portrayed as an attack on the Jewish community, a community that should feel safe and not be deemed liable for what Israel does in Gaza. In any democratic country, everyone should feel safe expressing their views without intimidation, and this must apply to everyone. Yet, civil liberties and freedom of thought are being taken away by the government through fearmongering when it comes to certain topics, primarily the Israeli-Palestinian one, despite the fact that the official government narrative itself changes regularly based on its interests. For example, Britain previously designated Zionist militias as terrorist groups. During British Mandate of Palestine, many of these militias conducted terrorist attacks against British soldiers, buildings, and equipment, killing many of them. Most notably in the King David Hotel bombing of the British headquarters, when Zionist militia members disguised as Arabs attacked it, killing 91 people, injuring many, and leaving part of the building collapsed. They tried to blame it on the Arabs, but they failed and their plan was revealed. The same groups later formed the IDF, and its leaders became prime ministers of Israel and senior officials leading the country. In fact, IDF in Hebrew is short for Tzahal, Tzva Haganah Yisrael, consisting the name Haganah, which was the main Zionist militia that conducted terrorist activities before the establishment of Israel and had the biggest part in forming the country's army. The same Haganah that not only killed British soldiers but also many Jewish people as well. In one of their biggest attacks against Jews, the Haganah killed 267 Jewish migrants fleeing Nazi Europe when they sabotaged the ship Patria in what was known as the Patria disaster. The ship was carrying 1,800 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. The Haganah opposed the fact that the British refused to let them enter Palestine because they did not have the right permits. So, they sabotaged the ship, killing 267 of them and injuring hundreds. This is just one example. There are plenty of others. The reason I'm giving these examples is to amplify the truth that many people are unaware of. Terrorists became Britain's closest allies. The only difference is that now they do not consider them as such. Therefore, the notion that we should somehow believe our government with its stance towards Israel is not only absurd but also flawed, and the examples that I've presented show just how. With the Palestinian case, 33 other countries share the same view as the UK towards Hamas, mostly allies of Israel and by the request of Israel. However, 161 countries don't. Statistically, this means 83% of the world's countries consider Hamas to be a legitimate political organization. But the IDF and Zionist militias are now legit. You can show them support, physically volunteer, send money, wave flags, and praise their actions regardless of how brutal they are, as we've seen throughout Israel's bloody history. They regularly kill, abduct, abuse, detain innocent Palestinians and other nationals. So far, they killed over 100,000 Palestinians. They torture them regularly, detain underage children, bomb civilians indiscriminately, support armed settlers against Palestinian farmers, ban Palestinians from movement, cut off water and electricity, and physically implement the institutionalized racist apartheid state. It's perfectly legal to support them, in the UK that is. Israel carries regular attacks not only on Palestinians but also on overseas citizens. It commits targeted assassinations, invades independent countries and occupies them. It did it not only with Palestine but also with Egypt, Lebanon and Syria. Remember, they did not give up the Egyptian-occupied lands until Egypt went to war with them on the 6th of October, 1973, and forced Israel to withdraw, despite Sinai being the most sacred place in the Jewish tradition, as it is regarded as the birthplace of the Torah, where Moses received the Ten Commandments. They also did not retreat from Lebanon until they were met with fierce resistance twice. According to the official UK government website, one reason that determines the proscription of an organization as terrorist is the threat that it poses to the UK. There have been several undercover investigations that revealed the level of Israeli interference in British politics, actions that undermine British democracy. I've never seen any Palestinian interference in internal British domestic matters. There's more to it. The decision to label certain organizations did not stem out of interest for Britain, its people, nor its foreign policy, but it was a government submission to pressure from the Zionist Israeli lobby in the UK, a lobby that had been exposed many times in the past and is considered by many as the strongest in the country. In fact, Hugh Lovett, a senior fellow from the European Council on Foreign Relations, wrote a whole article about how blacklisting Hamas, for example, which was democratically elected and it is a key player in Palestinian politics, is damaging for Britain's foreign policy and restricts the ability to achieve peace between Israelis and the Palestinians. Now you may ask, why would the UK want to harm its ability to achieve peace? Or is it not interested in peace between Israel and Palestine, just like the US isn't, and wants this conflict to last as long as possible with as much as possible gains for the military-industrial complex and greedy elites? Or, in the case of the British government, could it be that it's taking this position so it doesn't open up the dark chapters of its history full of colonization and enslavement? Does it not want to admit that it's part of the problem for creating Israel and giving it a free hand to occupy, ethnically cleanse, and abuse indigenous Palestinians? Some governments want the Palestinians to be defenseless and give a free hand for Israel to do as it pleases. They don't consider that the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, let alone be proactive in taking back what is theirs. To them, that right is reserved to Israel only, the colonial apartheid state. The countries that are supporting Israel are completely disregarding international law and the many UN resolutions that explicitly support Palestinians' national rights to statehood, sovereignty, right to return, and the right of resistance. I will give UN Resolution 45/130 as one example out of many. This resolution praised the Palestinian resistance, the Intifada, and even called it heroic. It criticized Israel for its brutal suppression of this uprising. It reaffirmed the legitimacy of people's struggle for independence, territorial integrity, national unity and liberation from colonial domination, apartheid, and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. It even included a clause strongly condemning governments that do not recognize these rights, which is exactly what the US and a fraction of other governments are doing. Even many Israelis who served in the IDF show clear support for Palestinians' right to resist. The likes of Eran Efrati, who had a long interview with Abi Martin titled "I Was the Terrorist," about his experience in the Israeli army, implementing apartheid in the West Bank and systematically abusing, harassing, and killing innocent Palestinians, in many cases just for fun. Or Miko Peled, an ex-elite IDF soldier who served in one of the highest-ranking units of the Israeli army and whose father was one of Israel's greatest generals in the Six-Day War, who then turned into a vocal critic of Israel, campaigning against its injustice and brutality. In fact, Ehud Barak, the previous Israeli prime minister, had a Freudian slip during an interview in 1998 when he said that if he were a Palestinian at the right age, he would have joined one of the terrorist organizations. These facts are deliberately censored and ignored to suppress people's natural instinct to support a just, humane cause and artificially generate support for a brutal, criminal and racist regime. After all, the Palestinians are fighting for the same reasons the Ukrainians are fighting for, albeit for a much older case. The Ukrainians receive all the support regardless of the groups fighting on their side, yet the Palestinians receive all the condemnation, demonization and labeling. Why is it so? The Palestinians are asked to condemn the actions of Palestinian fighters, despite them being the ones under occupation. But the Israelis are not being asked to condemn the far larger brutalities, killings, war crimes of the Israeli forces, despite them being the racist occupiers. Why? Do the people asking for condemnations also condemn the black resistance against slavery and apartheid? Do they condemn the Jewish resistance against Nazi Germany? Do they condemn themselves for fighting against the foreign occupation? They don't. In fact, they celebrate them as heroes, teach about them in the history books, and glorify them, despite any wrongdoings they may have done, which they have. It's time for the hypocrisy and moral high ground fantasies to stop. We have a humane responsibility to strongly oppose the government with its shameful, complicit stance in supporting war criminals, occupation and genocide, and call, once and for all, for a one-state democratic solution that will enable Palestinians and Israelis to peacefully live next to each other in peace and dismantle the apartheid, racist, supremacist regime.